Joel Sucher, S-U-C-H-E-R, 76 years old, born March 28th, 1949 in Liebeck, Germany. I came to the States when I was 4 months old. My parents were both Auschwitz survivors. I was born in a DP camp in Liebeck, Germany, which at that time was in the British zone of occupation. So I grew up working class background. My father struggled to make a living. He was in the rebuildable auto parts business, meaning he just picked up junk from auto dealers and resold it. Well, it's kind of like almost genetic. I mean, having been from that kind of background, DP camp, whatever, I always kind of hated bullies. It was kind of a genetic thing. I hated them in school. I hated them in the street. I get into fights with bullies. I'd often get my ass kicked, but I was just kind of a genetic thing. So by the time I got to high school, I went to an all-boys technical school. It was Brooklyn Tech. Now it's co-ed. At that time, it was, I think, the second largest high school in the country, but it was kind of all full of people who were being tracked into industrial professions, machinists, whatever. I, together with a small group of oppositionally minded folks, always kind of rebelled. And at that point, someone said, well, you're kind of an anarchist. I said, yeah, I guess I'm an anarchist. When I was growing up, I was 9 years old. I met a guy. He lived in the apartment building adjacent to mine. His name was Stephen Fischler. That was when I was 9. We went on. We're still friends. Actually, he's the co-principal in the company we have, which is Pacific Street Films. He lives in Seattle now, but the two of us have shared this political trajectory since that time. And, you know, in high school, it was kind of amorphous. By the time we both decided that we were going to go to NYU, it started to congeal into something that was more coherent. At that time in 1969, there was a lot of student unrest, as you can imagine. It was Vietnam, whatever. So we kind of got involved with a group called Transcendental Students. The original intent of Transcendental Students, or TS for short, was we were going to go in and free up space at the university so that kids who were being forced to endure this boring recitation of the course curriculum could have a space where they could party, have fun, whatever. So we did that. I think it was 69. We went in, we took over, I think it was Saf's study hall in main building at NYU in Washington Square College. I was saying, hey, come on, let's go, let's have fun. We brought in wine. There was a lot of dope. We really kind of, you know, had a good time. And at that time, I was just getting into film. I had bought a second-hand Bolex camera, which, believe it or not, I still have. And even better, it works. So we filmed the events. It was all silent. I think we had a tape recorder. And the dean of discipline at the time, his name was Harold Whiteman, he was kind of given the task of putting an end to this. But what we did is instead of kind of like, you know, resisting, we kind of turned it into a birthday party for him. And we had a birthday cake and we filmed this and whatever. And we basically called this film, I Am Curious, Harold, after the Swedish film at the time that was becoming popular, I Am Curious, Yellow. It's kind of a softcore porn film. So that was kind of our introduction into the political scene at NYU. And it also put Transcendental Students kind of in the student consciousness. At the time, we were successful to the degree where the university figured better to let us do our thing than to kind of like actively bring in the cops. They did call the cops for the takeover, but it was kind of, it came in a wet. But this time they said, okay, you can have there's a coffee shop called Her Roots at the time. It was run, it was kind of, where people came and had coffee, but the university owned it. So the university administration said, hey, we'll give you this place and you could take it over as your little kind of hangout. Well, we did, and given our priorities at the time, TS, we were flooded with the contradiction of, yeah, we wanted to be open to everybody, but a lot of the people who were coming in were drug addicts, were kind of skills from the street. And so it ended up, we had to kind of have a little bit of a goon squad to get these characters who walk in, go to the bathroom and shoot up. We had to get them out. So it became kind of a problem. The other problem at the time was we were involved in doing anti-surveillance work. There was notoriously the NYPD's Red Squad. And we had started to film them when they would come to demonstrations, specifically to NYU, and kind of try to, get as much info as I could on us. And at the time, myself and Steve were in Marty Scorsese's Sight and Sound class. And he became, in a way, a tacit supporter. Like, we would get equipment from, through him that other students couldn't, sound equipment, sync equipment, so we could record. And we would film the cops who come to NYU. We filmed it, and that became the basis of the film we did in 1971 called Red Squad, which is kind of still iconic. I mean, it's still shown and written about. And most recently, it was in the New Yorker. I forgot the writer, who actually had been an intern with us. He wrote this glowing piece about Red Squad. So anyway, that kind of solidified our political vision, which is kind of, challenging authority, but not in a peaceful way. I mean, toward the end of my NYU tenure, when I started to read Bakunin and Malatesta, you kind of understood what anarchism was really about, which I still believe. It's about mutual cooperation. You don't need people to tell you to do this, to do that. You can kind of define your own life in a cooperative way that doesn't screw over people, which, you see today is the big debate. You don't need a king. You don't need somebody to tell you this. However, I think that, anarchist philosophy, which I kind of think is malleable and needs to change with the times. So going on, after we graduated NYU, we started to make films. And one of the films we got involved in is a film that was actually funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities called Anarchism in America. Now, Anarchism in America, which was ironically funded by the NEH, which now pretty much is defunded. We went around the country. It was based on a book by, I think his name was Daniel DeLeon, I think, who basically said that Americans essentially, genetically, their DNA is anarchists. Whether they call themselves anarchists or not, they're anarchists. So we took this thesis on the road. We went around to around the country, seeing what really constituted, this kind of anarchism that's not called anarchism. Whether it's, a truck driver on the road who wants to run his own business, or this self-managed textile company, I think it was in North Carolina. These were examples we thought that kind of were emblematic of Americans' inherent anarchism. Then we did the obviously people who were anarchists. We also had the luck to go down to Cuernavaca, Mexico, where we filmed the folks who had fled from Spain. We filmed Molly Steimer. I mean, that kind of still resonates. And Molly Steimer was Emma Goldman's, right-hand man, so to speak. So we filmed them watching this newsreel of Emma Goldman when she came back to the States. And talking about Emma, whatever. So these were people that we sort of engaged with who were first-person spectators to anarchism, and then there were all these, the comrades who had fled from Spain who were members of the Senate and the FI. So that became part of anarchism in America, the film. Now, the critique of that film is, and we did receive some criticism, which I think was well-deserved. In fact, Freedom Magazine, today is the 19th. I think they're going to release a piece I wrote for Freedom Magazine, which is my own critique of the shortcomings of anarchism in America. I pointed out the example of this truck driver who we filmed. This truck driver, he wanted to have autonomy in the way he kind of, ran his operation, his truck. But today, that truck driver would probably be a Trump supporter. So that there are inherent flaws in that film, which a lot of people know about, that I'm critical of myself. But I think it's kind of, again, this kind of developing critique about what is the role of anarchism today. More toward present day. Well, I think that I do a lot of writing and have been. One of the interesting asides is I was probably the only anarchist who was ever hired to write for American Banker, the trade journal. Now, why was I hired? Because in 2011, it was Occupy. And I was doing a lot of writing. And so I was approached by the then editors of American Banker to say, listen, we would like you to, if you agree, to become a blogger, pay me whatever, to explain what Occupy is all about. Okay, so I did. I lasted for about a year until I had gone through a rather difficult divorce and custody dispute. And basically, my house went into foreclosure. So one of the foreclosure attorneys, who had already gotten a reputation in New York of being a real prick, decided to write a poison pen letter to American bankers. Mr. Suchabala. And anyway, so after a while, they said, okay, listen, I knew the executive editor said, listen, we're going to have to kind of put bylines on the pieces, some of your pieces. But you know what? It was kind of the beginning of the end. So then I went to write for Huffington Post. I wrote for In These Times. And then I wrote for Observer. I think this was beginning in 2016. Now, Observer at the time was owned by the Kushner family, and the executive editor was Ken Kurson. Now, Ken Kurson, who was pardoned by Trump, was about polar opposite in political beliefs from me. He knew what my political beliefs were. He hired me to write feature articles. I write feature articles on Ken Burns, not my favorite guy, Marty Scorsese, former teacher, Oliver Stone, who was a classmate. And some of these people, their PR people, tried to kill the pieces. But actually, Ken Kurson, to his credit, he basically defended. So that was a kind of weird relationship that I had. And now, it's under new management, so to speak, even though I think the Kushner family still has an ownership position in Observer. But to get back to your question about what is my... I work with other groups in terms of trying to make sure that members in the community, mainly minority members of the community, mainly Latinos, Haitians, of which there are a sizable number, where I am in Westchester County, are protected. Again, it goes back to my thing about bullies. I fucking hate bullies. I don't care who they are. So the thing is, and I don't know, I was always brought up with I forgot, was it Faulkner who basically said, I'm not sure, that if you ever find yourself in need always turn to a poor person. Both my kids, who are both lawyers now, I've always, basically drummed that into their head. It's always the people who have the least that are going to give you the most. And that's kind of the way I feel about this movement. To the question, how would I explain anarchism? All I would say is, listen, left in a perfect state, this Hobbesian thing of people killing one another. I said, no. Left in a perfect state where people were able to pursue their lives, they weren't, in need of, food, the basic human necessities. People would get along. And this is what, Kropotkin would say, that, in the conquest of bread, that once you're able to, and Bookchin in post-scarcity anarchism, I have to say we were very close to Murray throughout his career, even though toward the end, I really had some problems with all his, his critiques of anarchism. He was a major part of anarchism in America. So I would just say, listen, people would get along. If everything was taken care of, there would be no need really to kind of, whack your neighbor over the head because he has, 2 apples, as long as you had 2 apples as well. And even in the animal kingdom, it's they've kind of taken these examples of animals who cooperate rather than fight. So that's my simple explanation. To always question authority, question this, question that. I was considered to have oppositional syndrome. I was so bad that in high school I was thrown out of Brooklyn Tech for a semester, and my parents were told they need to send me to a psychiatrist. So I said, yeah, your son has opposition. I forgot what the psychiatric term is, oppositional whatever syndrome, which I do to a great degree. And I'm not, it doesn't bother me. Because if somebody tells me this, I'm going to say, okay, convince me. Somebody says to me, oh, it's Soros. Oh, it's space lasers. Oh, this didn't happen. All this bullshit that floats around in the conspiratorial brains of these morons. Okay, yeah, okay. It's chemtrails that are fucking changing the atmosphere. Where's the proof? So I think that's a convincing role for anarchists to basically say, okay, I'm open to you presenting your argument, but if your argument is bullshit, I'm going to present the counter argument. Although I am kind of in love with the Mark Twain quote, which Mark Twain is the guy, so to speak. Never argue with an idiot. They'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. So I try to not argue with people I know are idiots. I don't know. It's very difficult because now you have with the rise of digital journalism, AI, it's people lack critical thinking. I mean, one of we interviewed the dead Kennedys and Jello Biafra in Anarchism in America. But this is like, when did we do Anarchism in America, 80, 81? But basically, he discusses the lack of critical thinking. And it's far worse now because it's absolutely, the level of critical thinking is near zero. Whether you can argue that's caused by, digital addiction, by, whatever, that's the problem. How can it be countered? I wish I knew. I mean, you go to a place like Finland, actually, my wife has her roots. I mean, they have one of the best educational systems in the world. They basically emphasize, beginning in elementary school, critical thinking, not looking at something and asking yourself, does this sound like it makes sense? In this country, look at all the fucking Ponzi schemes that are going on in hidden history. People are stupid. And I'm not talking just about the ordinary people, because they're as dumb at the top. On Wall Street, for instance, which I've written about quite a bit. I mean, these people will buy into. I just saw something about the WeWork scandal and how the valuation was like in the billions. Because JP Morgan, whatever, bought into it. These people are easily tricked as well. So how can you counter all this? I don't know. I wish I knew. I think it's developing. We're also faced with the surveillance future. It's another area that both myself and Steve Fischel have been involved in, and we still are involved in. And back in the old days, you know, we would, in fact, the New York City Archives was a recipient of a dump from the NYPD of their surveillance film, that they had in their basement, so to speak. They gave it to the New York City Archives, put it online. Guess what? We found stuff of them filming us, filming them. And the technology, like with this camera, is so primitive. So now the technology is kind of so insanely sci-fi, so to speak, that it's really something that even today few people understand the ramifications. So if anything, I think that's kind of an area that anyone who has progressive ideals needs to pursue.